I think we'll kick off. We've got quite a few questions and comments and chats taking place, which is fantastic. And thank you to all of our speakers for such inspirational presentations, lots and lots of food for thought. So in this session, I'd like to invite those of you who have questions to come on the camera and on the microphone if you're happy to do so. It's always nice to see some faces. And I was wondering, Richard, Loretto, if you're there and would like to come in on the mic, if you have a question, if you'd like to come and introduce yourself and then put the question to the panel. Rich, you've asked a few questions around pace of change, socioeconomic considerations, and also consumer behaviour. So I wondered if you'd like to pose those questions, if you're there.
I think that's, can you hear me?
Yes.
On the consumer behavior side, I think that's one of the big challenges. I know that on the message or response, Andy has kind of challenged it was 93. I think it was 93 from what I've got. But anyway, even at 50%, you know, there's in the overall circle of flow, if consumers are not putting the packages or the end-of-life products into the right bins or right places, then we have a sort of a major failure in the material flow. I know Andy said about Be Mighty, but I don't know what that entails. But I'm wondering if there's sort of bigger, better programs elsewhere that can help turbocharge that. It seems leaving it to consumers to do make their own choices at home isn't really working. And from what I can see across Europe in my business, I don't see anybody's got it working yet.
Great, thank you. Andy, would you like to respond to that first?
Yeah, hopefully, I think we are doing quite well in terms of being third in the world on recycling, but we still have a lot more to do. So we have various ways of persuading people to recycle more. The Be Mighty campaign was a £1 million campaign, TV advertising campaign last year, and it was done through a segmentation approach, looking at attitudes and behaviours, and looking at the particular sectors of society who are least predisposed towards recycling, and then using the relevant media to try and target them and persuade them. There are several local authorities who are taking a bit more of a stick approach, in that they have powers to require people to separate out their recyclables. And certainly my own council here, Swansea, has done it. I've noticed some of my neighbours have had stickers on their bins. If that happens frequently and the warning letters are ignored, then fixed penalty notices are applied. I think they sent warning letters to about 10,000 people, and in the end only fined 3 people who persistently carried on not recycling. The other angle, of course, is with EPR, that we're now going to mandate labelling, so that in the future it says it's either recyclable or not recyclable. So it's a lot easier for people to understand what they should put in the recycling bin and what they shouldn't put in, particularly if they have a commingling system. You know, any contamination can cause problems there. We advocate curbside sort in Wales, so 15 out of our 22 local authorities require everyone to support their recyclables into separate boxes and bags, not into just one dry mix recycling bin. So despite that, it maybe not being quite as easy, we still have a fantastically high recycling rate, but we need to do more.
Sure.
Great, yeah, thanks Andy. And we had a couple of questions. Rich asked a question and then Ishmael around socio-economic modelling and the impacts of the transition towards a circular economy. And I just wondered, John or Raymond, if you had factored any socio-economic modelling into your work.
I'm happy to go first, and then Raymond, follow after. So yeah, so the first thing I suppose I'd say, and this is I have a slight issue with the term behaviour, because in itself it implies that individuals have the agency and autonomy by which to control their lives around them, when in essence we are more defined by sort of the practices which are within our community. And in essence, our behaviour is controlled by the institutions, the infrastructure, the economic system around us. So I always have a slight problem with an overly liberalised approach to what are large social problems that need a collective response. And so and that doesn't mean that it's not right to tell someone, to tell someone off for not doing what they do on occasions. But if we create an infrastructure and put £27 billion into road building, it's not too surprising that people might buy more cars. And if we have a system in place which encourages them to replace them all the time, but it's not overly surprising that in essence we that we are in essence creating this sort of continual flow of more and more products. So I suppose that's my one point. And in terms of how that then links to socioeconomic impacts, we often find that we place often taxes on areas which are consumed by lower income groups, and we often have lower taxation attached to higher income groups. And that seems to continue, and that seems to exist strongly with climate policy and potentially also carries on to other policy areas. And I think it's an uncomfortable truth that we don't ever evaluate enough and we don't talk about enough.
All right, thanks, John. And Raymond, did you want to come in on the back of that?
Yeah, could I actually politely disagree with John here on the issue of institutions, behavior, individuals? So it also works the other way around, in that individuals are shaping institutions and the world around them, not indeed thinking it's always the individual that shapes the world. There is a sort of impact of institutions on individuals, but it also works the other way around. And then we have the entire collective action agenda. I stop here, and certainly we can have another chat about this, including people around. I do think there have been some scenarios done. I was involved in one myself where we came up with a civil society leads scenario with modeled assumptions about less consumption by consumers, like fewer items in the shelf, extended lifetime, more care for the lifetime of durable goods, including textiles, etc. And we came up with quite some surprising results that, yes, it was helpful towards circularity and increasing resource productivity. And the macroeconomic impacts were not that bad at all, because we had like less exports, but also we modeled a lower working time with like impacts on the income evidently, but also then more spare time. So that was a sort of scenario we tried to develop. And I think there are good ways of translating individual behavioral changes into more aggregated impacts on the economy, and then indeed work on a scenario where it's not just meaning less profits for companies, but really more innovation, more change, and then changes throughout the economy, including their socioeconomic structure.
Great, thanks, Raymond. So I'm going to pass over to Mike, if you'd like to come in and introduce yourself and ask your question. Then I'm going to go to Peter to pick up some of the other questions from the chat. So hi, Mike. Oh, I think you're on mute. We can't hear you. Oh.
I'll pick up a question, Fiona, while Mike's sorting out his microphone.
Yeah, that would be great. We'll come back to you, Mike.
Mike on the mic. Okay, I'm going to go back to Marcus, who kicked us off earlier on and has sat through the three other presentations. And I think what I've observed from the conversation is exactly what sort of we put on our opening slide. Lots and lots of different questions, lots of approaches, lots of methods, lots of data. So I'm going to go over to Marcus and talk about the observatory, because we want to keep this conversation going outside of this meeting and make sure that whatever we create is able to respond to the types of debates that are taking place, whether it's recycling in Wales, Amazon's wish to influence consumer practices, etc. So, Marcus, do you want to just say a little bit about your thoughts, having kicked us off and then heard the other three presentations?
Yeah, it was a pleasure, Peter. And thanks also to the other speaker. I think it's been a fantastic overview on what is possible already with what we know today to model potential implications of being more circular. And I think what I took away from this conversation, that there was a mentioning of having national accounts, having input-output analysis, and that there's a chance to actually break this down to much more granular level on products. And I think that's where the opportunity sits with the centers, because we have a lot of resource capacity, a lot of corporate partners involved that actually know a lot about what's happening at the more micro stage in the product-specific elements. I think that would be wonderful further discussion to think through how could we actually link sort of the capacity at macroeconomic modeling with what is needed at the macroeconomic to see what's actually feasible. And I think that discussion, I think, could drive a lot of ideas on how to actually prioritize certain interventions, and also how to complement the measurements at macroeconomic level, what it actually means for individual actors that are part of the consortium. I think that was, for me, sort of one very sort of pursuable insight out of the conversation that we have. And I think from the consumer point of view, I think that a lot of the value chain that we have been looking at, although they start from material perspectives, they will enter a stage where sort of business to business or business to consumer element will be a part. I think so, looking also at the usage element, and potentially, as John pointed out, that if you go for a more resource productive, sort of more longevity driven element, that this could actually try to decouple a lot. So I think what we see at the value chain level, at the activity level, I think we're very hopeful if you find productive ways to consolidate this in a joint research going forward.
Great. I don't know whether Mike got back on his audio. Mike, are you there? Do you want to type your question or remind us which question it was, Mike, and we can pitch that in? If I could just follow on though from Marcus, and I'll ask this question to John and Raymond in the first instance, but not excluding Andy. When I put my original slides on, one of the areas that I thought we needed to work on collectively was around a UK circular economy data strategy to capture a lot of what we've been talking about today and not reinvent the wheel. And John, I know you've done some great work through CREDS on a data strategy for energy demand, and wonder whether you could say a little bit about that. And then Raymond and Andy, if you just want to come back in and talk about that as an activity and how that could be taken forward over the coming weeks. So John first.
Yeah, so I suppose I feel there needs to be a change in philosophy from thinking that asking industry or even households for data is seen as a cost burden and not an advantage, to exactly the opposite, where by collecting that data we are able to design national policies which are more coherent and consistent. And I think there's been a slight change in some government departments around that notion that we're just placing a burden on industry to actually we might be able to help and work collectively with them. So that was sort of one of the key areas I suppose I'd like to see improve. In terms of more specifically to the resource flow side, I suppose we're very limited by the fact that our analysis is based on the flows of materials into the economy on a yearly basis. And this means we have very poor data on the stocks of materials that we need. And I think it's a real problem that we don't have a really sort of comprehensive sense of what's in the system, especially if we're hoping to obviously extend its life and reuse it as much as we possibly can. So it's another area where it shows that one single modelling approach can't provide all the answers, but we need a comprehensive understanding of what might come out of the system each year to be able to know how we can ensure that that can be used effectively as secondary material as opposed to a waste product.
Great. And Andy wants to respond, and I don't know if Raymond wants to, and then Mike Tregant's put his question into the box for you, Raymond, so you might want to look at that and respond to that at the same time. Andy, over to you.
I don't know if there's anyone from BEIS on the call, but 3 or 4 years ago, they set up the National Materials Data Hub project that was to look at the stocks and flows of all materials across the UK and the parts of the UK. So I was representing the devolved administrations on the steering group. ONS sort of took over the work, but then things have been a bit quiet over the last year or two, not just because of COVID, but I think ONS have been having to look at their priorities. But that was a potentially really exciting project. It involved you know, a lot of the key players who understood material flows and waste data, so it was including some of the waste companies, but also experts on plastics and metals, etc. So I'll try and put NICE back in touch with whoever it was in Bays. I'll go back to the email on that. And just to those of you who are old in the tooth like me might remember the BIFA award work that was done on mass balance studies across the UK. Unfortunately, it predated widespread use of the intranet, so I cannot find any electronic copies of the documents, but they did mass balance studies of the key raw materials across the UK. So if you can get hold of, it was Peter Jones from BIFA who led on that. Just remind everyone there's the waste tracking project that all 4 nations are working on, which will be an electronic system to track all waste. And then of course there's the EPR system that will track all packaging placed on the market across the 4 nations, and then linked to waste tracking, and then how that's managed. So so there is a national sort of digital approach led by Alistair Paul, looking at the acquisition of all of this data. So DEFRA are leading on it, but we've got an input. But that connection with Bays, I think, is really important. They recognise that businesses wanted this data and therefore should be able to provide it because it was in their commercial interest, understand the stocks and flows of raw materials, particularly secondary materials.
Great. Okay, I'm conscious of time, Andy. Raymond, were you going to respond to both that point and Mike's question?
I'll try to be super quick. One of the data that I would like to just see better and more regularly gathered is data on the share of material cost in manufacturing companies that was articulated by the Community Innovation Survey years ago, but I would really like to see an update like year by year, and also how it affects manufacturing. This would be interesting then to study the behavior of purchasing managers and companies. On the big question that Mike raised on the values and macroeconomic modeling, it's indeed not straightforward. We know the data from like a World Value Survey. We are trying to study, and we discussed the Maslow pyramid. What it needs to be translated in is like purchasing decisions by consumers, whether they are based on certain values or not. So that is the question that is most relevant from, say, our economic perspective. And then indeed you can do different analysis in behavioral economics or other realms on what type of consumers prefer, what type of purchasing or treatment of certain goods. So it can be combined, but it's not straightforward.
Great. Fiona, back to you. Are there any questions that have jumped out that we haven't covered? And maybe just leave 1 or 2 minutes at the end just to do a bit of a summary of what next.
Yeah, sure. Catherine, I don't know whether you're still online. You've put a few comments in the chat around reducing consumption, and particularly around kind of advertising campaigns, and also the concept of a balanced scorecard of country level KPIs. I wondered if you wanted to expand on that a bit more.
Yeah, I think there are about 4 questions in there, weren't there? So the balanced scorecard thing was perhaps following on from the recent OECD, and I think G20 got on board with global minimum corporation tax. So it was kind of, you know, could we do anything around that for minimum taxation levels for virgin resources and things. And then I think what I've noticed over the last few months is that most of the circular economy activity I'm seeing is around what we might call new generation materials, so replacing technical materials with biological ones, or putting some recycled content in, or making something more recyclable in theory. And none of that is actually going to make a dent in our production and consumption. It's just swapping a few materials. And when I've looked at you know, carbon emissions and all the ecological destruction, all the kind of crises that we face, it seems to be all related to the amount of stuff we're producing, and we're getting less efficient. We're now using more materials for every $1 million of GDP, because we found and used all the easy to get at stuff. So it seems that we've got to slow it down, and that means durable products, repairable products, you know, reuse, sharing, that kind of thing, not swapping a few materials and allowing everybody to feel great because they've now got a, you know, in inverted commas, sustainable product. So I guess it would be good to hear anybody's thoughts on how we shift behaviour towards that.
Thanks very much, Catherine. Andy, did you want to respond first, and then anyone else that wants to jump in?
I was just putting something in the chat bar. So how about measuring how long each material is actually in productive use within that cycle? Because I recall statistics years ago saying that on average something like 90% of what we buy ends up in the bin within 3 months. So let's try and, you know, make that last 30 years. No, maybe that's a bit too long. But, you know, do we have indication of, on average, how long each material lasts in productive use? Is that a measure? I don't know. I just thought that out.
That's a great one, and I suspect if we went back to the 70s and 80s, we'd find that things lasted an awful lot longer. And those materials haven't changed, have they? It's just the planned obsolescence strategies. So I guess maybe measurements not just around materials, but around how long products stay in use, and maybe something like, you know, how long are the guarantees on products, and therefore we can call out those companies that are whittling things down and basing their entire business strategy on planned obsolescence.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious we've only got a couple of minutes left, so just to give the last couple of words to Raymond and then John.
Thanks a lot, Fiona. I like the idea of a taxation, and indeed the aggregate tax in the UK and the landfill tax are just good models that could be disseminated to other countries that have not done so. On the more general level, we'll probably really need also the raw material producers to have higher revenues for their share to cover their externalities, which will then indeed drive the material prices upwards, which also has a good effect on downstream users. But whether or not it extends the lifetime of products is another issue. So I do think that we need more dedicated measures, like having more repair cafes that would also raise the skills and the awareness among consumers. I just stop here in the interest of time, thank all people and all participants here for today, and then look forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. And John?
Yeah, I think, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the lines of question really is the fact that we have an economic model which is based on the throughput of as many materials as possible, and the need to try and expand that to keep that growth growing on an annual basis. And in essence, while we should of course try and use better materials and so on, it's not mutually exclusive, unless we answer that broader question about how does economy serve society and what kind of society do we want, and move away from just a narrow definition of progress as to whether GDP has gone up and down. We face serious challenges in meeting rapid cuts, and that involves politicians standing up to vested interests and creating a positive vision of a better future, which isn't based on continued throughput of materials. Now, I know then, you know, I'm sure some people just think that this is fanciful, but unless we repeat that, I think we're not necessarily demonstrating the scale of the challenge and the scale of change that's needed.
Agree. I'm just putting in the chat a great book I'm reading at the moment that speaks exactly to that, is Less is More by Jason Hickel, with lots of good suggestions for you know, macro level strategies.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a really, really inspirational afternoon, and I think it provided a fantastic overview of what is possible and what the opportunity is, as well as obviously where the challenges are that hopefully the NICER programme and this community is beginning to address. And we are very much open to further collaboration. This is the first, as I mentioned, of our events. Our seminar event, so we'd welcome you to join us for the others that I'll put up the details in a second. And please do get in touch with us, because we would love to hear from you and involve you in the activities of the wider NICER programme and beyond. Peter, before I just put up the last slides, is there anything else you wanted to mention?
No, just to say it's great to still have 88 people online on a Friday afternoon at just gone 4:30. We had 170 at one point, which was great. And as you've said, this is the first of a series of events which will pick up some of the points that people have just been making. And Fiona, you're going to show them around the design challenge and the design opportunity. Another whole afternoon event on creating and capturing value from the circular economy. That's with Innovate UK and some work they've commissioned, and one or two people are in the room today. What does it look like on the ground? Circular business models, which addresses some of the points that Catherine's just referred to. So how can you double growth on 20% of the current resource throughput? You know, there's one of the ambitions for a circular economy, and what are the transformational pathways that would get us to that new state from where we are today, and can we really up the game? So that's really what the NICER programme is seeking to encourage, promote, advocate, and find solutions underpinned by evidence and data. And that's really what today has started off, is about the importance of data, the importance of modelling, the importance of evidence to help us work our way through quite complex questions and really difficult challenges. But I'm confident we'll be able to do that with some of the people who have been in this event, either speaking or contributing. So it's been a fantastic day, you know, and afternoon, and we will follow up with an output and a consultation document in due course. So Fiona, last word to you.
Great, thank you. As we mentioned, the event's been recorded, so it'll be made available on the Hub website along with the presentations from our speakers. If you want to find out anything further about the NICER programme or the Hub, please visit the website, which is here on this slide. We also have a quarterly newsletter, which would encourage you to sign up to, as well as our future events, as Peter's mentioned. So thank you all very much. Look forward to continuing the collaboration and the conversation with you, and we wish you all a very good weekend. Bye-bye.